Russia just deployed warships to protect an oil tanker from American forces. Europe is drafting contingency plans for a US move on Greenland. And Trump announced Venezuela will send us 50 million barrels of oil at market price. If you think these are three separate stories, you've already missed what's happening. The United States just signaled it's willing to break the post-1945 rulebook. And the response from Moscow, Brussels, and Caracas tells you everything about who saw this coming and who's scrambling. This isn't about Greenland. This is about whether territorial sovereignty still means anything when resources are on the table. Let's start with what actually happened. European allies, specifically within NATO planning committees, are now gaming out scenarios where the United States makes a formal move on Greenland. Not invades, let's be clear, but something between aggressive negotiation and coercive acquisition. The fact that allied military planners are running these scenarios tells you this isn't Twitter noise anymore. Denmark owns Greenland. Denmark is a NATO ally. And yet, European capitals are preparing for the possibility that Washington might pressure Copenhagen in ways that violate the spirit, if not the letter, of alliance obligations. Here's what most coverage misses. Greenland isn't about ice. It's about rare earth minerals, petroleum reserves in disputed Arctic zones, and military positioning against Russia and China. The Pichafik Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base, is one of the most strategically critical installations in the Western Hemisphere. It's the northernmost deep water port accessible year-round, and it sits directly on the routes China wants to open as Arctic ice melts. The US has wanted control of Greenland since 1946. Truman offered to buy it. The Pentagon has long-term basing rights. But full control, the kind where Washington decides extraction rights and transit rules, that's different. Trump floating this idea isn't new. What's new is the European reaction. They're not dismissing it. They're planning for it. That tells you two things. First, European intelligence services believe there's a non-zero chance this happens. Second, they've assessed that if it does happen, the US won't care what Brussels thinks. This is the collapse of allied consultation. The United States is moving from alliance leader to unilateral actor. And Europe knows it. Now, why does this matter beyond symbolism? Because Greenland's rare earth deposits are critical to battery production, missile systems, and every advanced technology that separates a great power from a regional one. China currently controls 70% of global rare earth refining. If the US secures Greenland's deposits, that's a direct counter to Beijing's chokehold on the supply chain. But here's the cost. If Washington pressures Denmark, a founding NATO member, into surrendering sovereign territory, that treaty alliance is functionally over. Not on paper, but in practice. Because every ally will now calculate that their territorial integrity is conditional on American interests. Poland is watching this. The Baltics are watching this. They're asking themselves, if the US can coerce Denmark, what happens when our territory becomes inconvenient? Now, Russia sends warships to escort an oil tanker being pursued by US forces. Let's break down what this actually means. The tanker in question is carrying crude under sanctions evasion schemes, likely involving ship-to-ship transfers, forged documentation, and flag-hopping through jurisdictions that don't enforce US secondary sanctions. This is standard procedure for Russian and Iranian exports since 2022. The US Navy has been interdicting these shipments, sometimes boarding vessels in international waters under the legal framework of enforcing sanctions. It's aggressive, it's legally murky, but it's been happening without major escalation. Until now. Russia deploying naval assets to protect a commercial tanker is a direct escalation. This isn't about one shipment. This is Moscow saying, we will use military force to ensure our oil reaches buyers, and if you want to stop it, you'll have to sink our ships. This is a Cuban Missile Crisis level game of chicken, except it's happening in slow motion across multiple choke points. The Danish Straits, the Turkish Straits, the Strait of Hormuz, every one of these is now a potential flashpoint. Here's the strategic read. Russia is betting the US won't fire on Russian warships over oil sanctions, and they're probably right. Because if the US does, that's a shooting war between nuclear powers. And if the US doesn't, then sanctions enforcement is over. This gets to a deeper problem. American sanctions only work if the rest of the world fears secondary punishment more than they want the oil. But Russia, China, India, and now tacitly much of the global south have decided they're willing to call that bluff. The tanker incident is a test case. If Russia successfully escorts sanctioned oil to a buyer, and the US does nothing, then every other sanctioned state, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, will adopt the same model. You just need a navy willing to challenge interdiction. And here's where it connects to Greenland. The US is now facing the reality that it can't enforce its will everywhere simultaneously. American naval presence is overstretched. The Pacific is the priority theater because of China. That means the Atlantic and Arctic are less defended. Russia knows this. That's why they're moving now. If the US is serious about Greenland, it will need to pull assets north. That weakens deterrence in the Black Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the South China Sea. Moscow is forcing Washington to choose. Now, Trump says the US will receive 30 to 50 million barrels of oil from Venezuela at market price. Stop right there. Let's count the contradictions. Venezuela is under US sanctions. Those sanctions specifically target oil exports. The Treasury Department has spent years trying to choke off Maduro's revenue. And now, the incoming administration is announcing a deal to buy millions of barrels directly. Either the sanctions are being lifted or they never mattered. Here's what this really is. A recognition that the US needs heavy crude, and Venezuela has it. American refineries on the Gulf Coast are designed for heavy sour crude that used to come from Venezuela and Mexico. When Venezuelan oil was sanctioned, it came from Canada. But Canadian production hasn't scaled fast enough, and domestic shale is light sweet crude, wrong grade for those refineries. So now the US is going back to Venezuela. But instead of admitting the sanctions failed, this is being framed as a negotiated deal. Market price. As if Maduro is doing us a favor. Let's be clear about what market price means here. It means Venezuela gets hard currency, sanctions evasion legitimized, and tacit use recognition that Maduro isn't going anywhere. This is the same administration that backed Juan Guaido as the legitimate president, that froze Venezuelan state assets, that threatened military intervention. And now we're buying their oil. Why? Because energy security beats ideology every time. The US needs to keep domestic fuel prices stable, keep refineries running, and avoid dependence on Middle Eastern suppliers who are increasingly playing both sides with China. But here's the second-order effect. If the US can cut deals with Venezuela, then every other sanctioned state is now negotiating. Iran sees this, North Korea sees this. They're learning that sanctions are temporary, that Washington will deal when it needs to. This undermines the entire sanctions-based order the US built after the Cold War, and the rest of the world is taking notes. The pattern. So now let's connect the three stories. Greenland. The US is willing to pressure allies to secure resources. Russia's tanker escort. Rivals are willing to militarize commerce to break sanctions. Venezuela oil deal. The US will trade with enemies when it needs to. The pattern is this: the rules-based international order is over. Not because anyone declared it dead, but because the major powers have stopped pretending it constrains them. The United States is acting like an empire again. Not the kind that runs colonies, but the kind that takes what it needs and dares anyone to stop it. That's what the Greenland posture is. That's what sanctioning enemies and then buying their oil is. Russia and China are doing the same thing. Escorting tankers with warships. Building islands in the South China Sea, ignoring treaties they signed. And the middle powers, Europe, India, Brazil, are realizing they're not players in this game. They're the board. Europe drafting plans for a US move on Greenland isn't about Denmark. It's about Europe realizing it has no leverage. If Washington wants Greenland, Brussels can't stop it. The best they can do is prepare for the fallout. That's the world we're entering. Not Cold War 2.0, something different. Call it the transactional order. Every relationship is conditional. Every alliance is temporary. Every resource is contested. Here's what that means in practice. Energy is now a weapon. Not just in the sense of Russia cutting off gas to Europe, but in the sense that every major power is securing supplies through coercion, sanctions evasion, or forced deals. The Venezuela arrangement is just the US doing what China's been doing with Iran for years. Territorial sovereignty is negotiable. If you have resources the great powers want and you can't defend yourself, your borders are a suggestion. Greenland today. Rare earth deposits in Mongolia tomorrow. Lithium in Bolivia. Cobalt in the Congo. Alliances are transactional. NATO isn't dead, but it's no longer the mutual defense pact it was designed to be. It's a coalition of convenience. And when convenience ends, so does the commitment. What happens next? So where does this go? Short term, watch the Danish response. If Copenhagen publicly rejects US overtures on Greenland but quietly begins negotiating, that tells you they've accepted the new reality. If they appeal to NATO or the EU for support and get silence, that's the alliance dying in real time. On the Russia tanker situation, watch whether the US Navy backs off or escalates. If American ships stop interdicting Russian-escorted tankers, sanctions enforcement is over. If they don't back off, we're one miscalculation away from a naval engagement between nuclear powers. On Venezuela, watch how this deal is structured. If it's formalized through Treasury sanctions waivers, that's one thing. If it's done quietly through intermediaries and shell companies, that's the US admitting it can't enforce its own rules. Medium term, expect every resource-rich region to become contested. The Arctic, Central Asia, Central Africa, the deep seabed, these aren't future conflicts, they're happening now. The difference is, the major powers aren't pretending it's about democracy or human rights anymore, it's about resources. And they're saying it out loud. Longer term, this ends one of two ways. Either the major powers establish new rules, new spheres of influence, new dividing lines, and we get a multipolar stability. Or they don't, and we get rolling instability, naval standoffs, coercive diplomacy, and the occasional shooting war over oil tankers and rare earth mines. Right now, we're in the second scenario. And nobody's steering toward the first. The United States wants Greenland. Russia will fight to move its oil. And we're buying crude from a government we tried to overthrow 3 years ago. If that sounds contradictory, you're still thinking in terms of the old rules. The new rule is simple. Take what you can defend, sell what you can move, and negotiate only when you have to. Europe is learning that lesson right now. The question is whether they'll accept it or try to build something different. Because if they don't, the next map you see of the Arctic won't have Danish borders. It'll have extraction zones and naval patrol routes. And nobody will ask permission. Do you ever look at the news and feel like it's all just chaos? A random series of events with no rhyme or reason? What if I told you that's not the case? The world isn't a collection of random accidents. It's a chessboard. Every move, every alliance, every conflict. It's all part of a grand strategy. From trade wars to international summits, these are calculated plays in a global game. To truly understand why things are happening, you need to see the board and know the players. That's exactly what we do here. We break down the strategies, analyze the moves, and help you understand the consequences that shape our world. If you want to see behind the headlines and grasp the real game of power, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Global Chessboard and start seeing the world differently. Thanks for watching.